My name is Sam Jenks, and welcome to another episode of The Way We Source, podcast hosted by Kodiak Hub, where we share our talks with procurement practitioners, leaders, experts, consultants, content gurus, and people that we find downright inspiring, diving into the role that procurement and sourcing plays in the way we live. If you like today's episode, make sure to rate the program and give us a follow. Today's guest is a seasoned supply chain and procurement leader with over 30 years of experience under his belt. He is a practitioner and operator turned consultant with deep roots in manufacturing environments where things actually have to show up on time, at quality, or the business stops. Our guest today has worked with global manufacturers on process effectiveness, digitalization, and change, while also teaching strategic and sustainable procurement at Malmö Business School in Sweden. He sits with a rare intersection of knowledge, practitioner, advisor, and educator with a front row seat on how procurement is evolving, where AI truly helps and where it absolutely does not. Welcome to the show, Wilbert Baerwaldt. Wilbert, we're so happy to have you.
Thank you, Sam. Thank you very much. Really an interesting introduction of myself. Never thought about that.
Well, it's nice to be able to reflect once in a while. I'm curious, during your career, right? You've said that procurement at its core is simple during our prep work, and that the business needs material or it stops. Why do you think that clarity gets lost so often within a manufacturing environment?
Oof, that starts already with a good question. I would assume that the clarity gets lost because things change continuously.
Mm.
And it is so difficult for individuals to keep track of all the things that are happening around them in order to, make sure that they are doing a good job. So that's really an important factor why things do not work out well as intended.
Yeah. When it comes to procurement in the manufacturing field, what do you think that makes direct material procurement fundamental, right? Maybe almost different than procurement in other roles as well.
When direct procurement does not work as planned, there's machines going to stand still.
Yeah.
And these machines can be large, they can be small, but there is people at the back end that are, missing materials to actually produce stuff. And if then organizations get to a mode of replanning their production plan, other things will happen, right? So if one brick does not fall into the right place, there's a lot of consequential steps that have to, that still have to fall in place. So the significance of this supply chain getting to a standstill, that is really a big difference from if you buy services or if you buy spare parts, for instance, right? Spare parts are spare parts, right? You need them in case of an emergency. A direct material is needed because you need, there's a customer behind it that wants to buy your product. So it's an important difference, I would say, between normal and between other procurement and direct procurement.
This is actually something that inspires me, right? Because I was just on site with a bottling company at the tail end of last year, and we got to sit into some of their workshops and talk about our solution, but also just learn a little bit more about their business. And it was very interesting to hear in their business. Obviously, they're creating plastics and utilizing utilizing the raw materials of plastics to be able to create bottling and then bottling waters and different types of drinks. The way in which procurement and planning needed to work side by side in that particular environment to make sure that there was going to be goods and materials on time, in full, at the right quality, ready to go into the manufacturing lines. You said the item of like the importance of not having to then replan. What does that relationship typically look like between procurement and planning? And what do you see is like a really healthy relationship there as well?
Procurement and planning, both both have to work hand in hand.
Mm.
Of course, in the ideal world, a planner prepares a plan for production. A procurement person picks up the plan and works in accordance with the plan and buys materials, so that at the stage when production is kicking in, materials are available. But plans change continuously.
Yep.
And sometimes those plans are so complex that the planning and the procurement team, they need to work together in order to visualize, in a sense, to highlight where things have changed that have the most significant impact.
Mm.
Could be related to a specific customer order, could be related to a specific quality on the machine, etc., etc. So there is the planning and the procurement departments, they need to work side by side in order to make things work. 95% maybe should run automatically, but these 5% is disturbing an awfully lot in the manufacturing halls.
Yeah. Do you have any concrete examples, just from your experience, right? You've worked in this space for a long period of time, of when maybe a wrench got thrown in the system and you needed to work closely with planning, and how did you overcome some of those challenges? I mean, you experienced COVID, right? How did you guys work to overcome those challenges then? And maybe what would be some words of wisdom to those that are out there that are looking to do the same?
There's plenty of examples where plans didn't work out as expected.
Mm.
This could be related to late deliveries just before Easter. It could be related to too little material delivered just before and campaign to a customer, for instance.
Mm.
The thing that really matters at that point in time is that everybody is up to date, up to speed with the available information, so that there is a possibility to steer the direction of the supply chain in the way you actually want it to move. It could be that you need to delay another customer order. It could be that you need to just inform the customer that is, fewer materials are being delivered.
Mm.
Communication in this is key, and keeping everybody, in the loop is that is the single most important, let's say, advice that I could give. That is also something probably that is not. It's a bit undervalued when it comes to education. Right? Students, they believe that they end up in a world where everything is well organized, everything is coming in easy. However, of course, as you and I know, it's all of these companies, there's a lot of dynamics, there's a lot of flexibility, there's a lot of things happening that makes you have to talk to one another in order to make sure that you are keeping everybody up to date. And this communication part in education, I think, is a bit undervalued. Students, I think, could learn a lot from how to communicate, the respect that is needed, the type of words that is being needed, etc., etc. So it's really important to underline this.
Yeah. I think that, I've had the pleasure of and honor of being brought in to, some undergraduate and graduate courses to be able to present a little bit more about, the space of SRM in practice. And I think it's always interesting talking to people that are in academia, but also on the other side of the business, or sorry, on the other side, right, in the real world, as practitioners or operators, right? And you've seen both sides of this coin. You still see both sides of this coin. What do you think, beyond the items that you just mentioned, is kind of the biggest gaps between academia and what's being taught, maybe in kind of in literature, versus the real world? Like, and how can educators, but also operators, start to close that gap collectively?
Mhm. That's a really difficult question. Um, uh, Typically, when you read scientific papers, the wording, the examples that are being used are often quite difficult. right? It's quite difficult to follow for the normal, practitioner, if you wish. The topics are often really specific. All the research take place either at a very general level that you look at, many different companies at the same time, and you try to find some correlation between them.
Yeah.
On the other hand, you can look at a very specific, set of companies, and then as a practitioner, you might think, but this is not really applicable to me, right? Because it's a different industry, it's a different, country, continent, whatever. I've read very interesting papers about companies in Nigeria, for instance, which might seem quite, far away from the European business world, but there's a lot of learnings that you still can use. But it means that practitioners, I think, often have difficulty to read the content of these scientific papers, and then to find actually the applicability to their own business. But there's so many learnings possible coming out of research that I'm really interested to, let's say, to bridge this between what professors are writing about or researchers are writing about, and what can be used in companies, in real world companies. So there is bridging it that is really important. I've done that already since I studied molecular sciences 30 years ago, where you see that there is so much good research taking place, but at the same time that companies in the agribusiness or the biomedical business, they are doing their own thing often, and I think that's a lost opportunity, if you wish. And of course, I need to be humble. It's not all companies miss the opportunity, and but there's a big opportunity for companies to take some of these findings with them. It also requires, as a practitioner, that you need to reflect on how actually these sort of studies apply to their environment. And that is, of course, that's another challenge for practitioners, because practitioners often are in a very dynamic and a volatile environment, and they don't have the time to just sit back and think about, okay, what did I read here, how can I use this in my world? So it's there's a number of different, let's say, complexities are coming together, but it's really important not to miss opportunities.
Yeah, I agree. And I think that it's easy as a practitioner maybe to become a bit myopic, right? My business, my world, and you forget to maybe take a step back and again see the forest for the trees. Can I just ask though, on that topic, the feedback loop the other way, what do you think maybe that educators and academia can be able to take from practitioners?
I guess there is. When you look at companies that have been researched, often the same names appear, right? It's like Ford, it is like Siemens, IKEA. It's large companies.
Your Fortune 100, pretty much.
And they have, of course, a sort of how do you call it? Way of working where they embed research and development in their way of working,
right?
In a very formal way. But the world of the large companies is in the end very small. There's many, many, many more small companies that also should understand that there's a high value in just sharing your, let's say, experiences with teachers and researchers, so that you yourself can learn from the research that is being done. But again, it requires a person to be open for this research aspect, and take the time to to open a dialogue with universities. So it's there's a lot of researchers are highly interested in having better access to data, right? And then a company is data, if you wish. So every professor that I talked to over the last years, they're always really excited to be able to get access to another company, because it gives so much more opportunity to learn and to develop and to make the models more robust and Yeah, so there's really I noticed this with, these teachers and researchers. It's really important.
Super interesting. Let's stay on the topic of manufacturing and procurement in manufacturing. So you work today, like we said, in Malmo Business School as a part-time educator. That's one of the hats that you wear. Another hat that you wear, obviously, is consultant to large manufacturing organizations and procurement teams within those organizations. When you walk into kind of a client, a manufacturing client, to be specific, for the first time, what is one of the kind of first signals that you get that tells you procurement in this organization is being trusted or just being tolerated, right? They actually have a strategic position, or they're just order takers in that business.
Right. Um, I would assume it is the organizational structure. What is immediately noticeable, of course, is if a procurement director or supply chain director actually reports to the managing director. Right? That's really an important aspect. I think specifically when it comes to manufacturing operations, the spend in procurement is often a really significant part of the total revenue of a company.
Sure.
And that needs to be taken really serious. So the organizational structure is really that's one of the first, let's say, highlights, if you wish.
Mm-hmm. Can we maybe double click there, actually, Wilbur? What would then what would an organizational structure that says that procurement maybe is not valued look like? Who would procurement maybe be reporting into?
Imagine you have an organization with a number of different manufacturing sites, for instance.
Yeah.
It could be that each of these sites have a separate procurement function. And the procurement function reports into the local site manager, for instance. What happens there is, the site managers, they will drive the procurement function, right? There will be very little alignment between the different manufacturing teams or procurement teams within manufacturing. Everybody will have their own set of suppliers. Everybody will have their own way of working with suppliers, contractual terms, etc., etc. Very little coordination in order to make sure that the suppliers that are being worked with are actually on the same level. That the contractual terms are at the same level. Pricing is at the same level. I've seen quite a few situations actually where one supplier is supplying to multiple sites and having multiple contracts in place. Right. So there's a lot of let's say interesting things happening if you're not putting the procurement function in a central role, specifically within manufacturing. So that's an how do you say that in English? Explanation mark, right? That's not a good situation to be in for a company.
Red flag,
A
maybe
red flag,
would be the term.
Yeah.
Yeah. Understood. Gotcha. And missing the opportunity for more of the strategic value that procurement can offer across, for example, a group and or collection of sites. Very interesting. Okay. So that's what bad looks like. What good would look like is, again, a direct line into the office of the MD or leadership, right? Obviously, with a holistic view over the spend that's going out the door, which, I'm not overstepping here, can be 60 up to 80% of the revenue in manufacturing.
Yep.
Correct by saying so?
Yes, yeah, very much so.
Yeah.
That is a significant share of the revenue.
Gotcha. So that's the first item, right? Visibility into the leadership. Any other items where you can see this procurement team is being trusted right now?
Then you would have to go into the next level of communication, how people are communicating with procurement, if they're being asked for advice in certain issues, or if they're being instructed to do something, order this, order that, etc., or how would you solve this, supply shortage, for instance. So it's I've seen quite a few organizations that are treating the procurement teams as an administrative role, not as a strategic, partner in the supply chain, but as an administration. And I can imagine that is happening because, just creating a purchase order, trying to put the purchase order into a supplier, of course, it's a very administrative function. But as you and I know, it's the selection process of suppliers, the negotiation that is taking place with suppliers, all of these things should be taken really serious if you don't want to lose too much money, because your 80% revenue share or procurement share can easily become 85% if you're not treating it very serious. So the way people are communicating with procurement teams, I think that would be a second red flag or an item to look at.
Great. Understood. It actually wakes another question, right? In manufacturing procurement, who's the customer, right? Is it the end customer? Is it the plant? Is it the planner? Is it the quality team? And how do you balance that?
I think there's a lot of organizational parts that consider themselves to be the customer. In the end, of course, it is only the person or the company that is buying your materials. There's no other customer. Right? Then, of course, next in line could be, the manufacturing director, could be the business unit manager, could be, different roles in the organization. When everything runs well, it doesn't really matter who the customer is because, things are running well. When things are not running well, then there's a lot of discussions about who actually should be listened to, who is the customer. That is a very difficult balance to find. Sometimes it's the person who is shouting the loudest, right? Sometimes it's the person who is having the strongest arguments. Could be that a sales manager says, we could lose the customer if we don't deliver, but the product itself that is missed is really tiny. So the sales manager now has a strong argument just to make sure that this customer is being delivered. It could be that a manufacturing director says, but if we have to produce this article before another article, we need to set up the whole machine in a different way, right? Which also costs a lot of money. And then maybe this person has the strongest argument. What is important in those sort of situations is really you have to consider that it's the end customer that is ultimately the customer. But at the same time, you need to find together the right balance and moving forward to working towards a solution, right? Because the problem exists, in any case, right? And that's a really tricky balance because there's a lot of important players in this whole discussion. It is, as you say, there's different roles, there's different people with different voices, and that is not always a very simple task. And then people are starting to fight, of course, because if sales is missing an opportunity to sell, that's not good for the sales person either. Right? If a manufacturing person has to stand still because of missing material or whatever, it's costing a lot of money, these sort of situations, and somebody is paying for this. And this is where supply chain thinking and value chain thinking comes into the picture, because you need to find the good balance together in order to find the right value or the optimum value for the customer. Those situations are really difficult to resolve often.
Interesting insights, and I think that as somebody that comes from sales, right? I can categorically say it's always someone else's fault, right? And if we can't find somebody to blame it on, then procurement is a perfect organization to point at. Jokes aside, though, we've now spoken for 15, 20 minutes. The most important thing is we haven't gotten around to AI yet. We got to get into it, right, Wilbert? I mean, it's on the tip of everybody's tongue. We have to do our due diligence here. I'm curious. You've seen a lot of machines running out on manufacturing lines. If procurement were the machine itself, which part do most organizations try to like AI optimize before that machine is properly built?
Oof, that is also a good question. Um, I believe companies most often try to fix data problems with AI. When cost centers or invoice numbers or the names of let's say suppliers, they are not in the right position where you would expect it, then companies try to throw in an AI application and make an assessment of or what the number should be, or where this the name of the company should be placed instead, etc., etc.
Yeah.
And I think the idea is good, but I believe that for many organizations, data quality is really too poor to put in an AI application in order to try to correct it, right? AI is, of course, working with a set of data of which we know it is to a very high level correct, right?
Right.
And then statistically, AI would say, okay, if you have this sequence of data, then it's very logical that the next step would be this data. But if the ingoing data is not clean, you will have a lot of problems in applying a reliable or getting a reliable AI answer out of the system. So the trying to correct wrong data with AI, I think, is one of these the key topics that companies now are using, which should not happen in a sense.
Yeah.
Because AI is again, the vast majority of the data that you work with has to be correct, has to be on the right place, has to be in the right position, the right coding, etc. And if your data already is all over the place, then AI will come up with answers all over the place.
Right.
That's a big challenge, I would think.
Well, I think one of the interesting things about agentic and or generative AI is that, particularly generative, is it will generate a outcome, right? The quality of that outcome, though, is based upon the inputs, the prompt or the data, the ingest of the model, right? So it does, the language of hallucination is talked about a lot. It can create a hallucinative state that feels and looks and smells real, but in reality, it tastes pretty bad when it's actually, digested. I think that we see this time and time again, but it's clear, obviously, then maybe cleaning quote unquote data is not somewhere that AI is where we should be focusing in procurement. Where have you seen proper applications of the technology in the role and in the businesses that you've gotten to look under the hood of?
One very clear application is one of the ones that you are offering from Kodiak Hub. Screening the market for suppliers, working with the procurement team to, let's say, prepare meetings, to summarize, the status of, certain discussions, to point at risks in the supply chain, those sort of things. This is where AI is extremely relevant at this point in time. Of course, when one of the challenges on that side is when you ask an AI application to summarize the risks in a certain supply chain, that will never stop, right? So there's a lot of dust around let's say the risk in the supply chain, which are not relevant really to a procurement person. But I think that is an area that will improve significantly over the next months, years, if you wish, right? So that is one area. Another area could be when you think about, let's say, preparing for negotiations, right? You can ask for, okay, I'm in this situation, I'm going to meet this supplier, give me some arguments why price should go down, or why I should expect, price increases from their side, etc., etc.
Right.
I think AI is able to give a lot of inspirational thoughts on things that you are preparing yourself. It could be on negotiation, could be on many other topics. I just read parts of a book that were presenting something like 50 different applications of AI using tools like ChatGPT or other tools, and there's some I would say quite inspirational topics being mentioned. In total cost of ownership, for instance, what you need to think about if you buy such a raw material, right? What are the impacts on on a certain company, for instance? Calculating a business case. What is it that I can think about? What are the approximate impact on ROI, for instance? So there's a lot of applications, let's say, around the hardcore buying of direct materials where you can use, let's say, AI. But the thing that people also forget is that you need to be an expert in order for AI to get, let's say, to get you a bit better expert, right?
Right.
Some people believe they become an expert just using AI, and that is a disaster. And that I'm seeing with students very often, that you read reports about topics that do not make sense at all, right? So then you can see the sort of prompt that is being put into a large language model, in ChatGPT or whatever. A report comes out perfect, sees, it looks really nice, but the content is not good. So you always need to, when you're using AI for inspiration, you need to be at a certain level in order to be able to pick up, relevant topics from the tool, from the application. People walk very quickly past that issue, and that's problematic, I think, right?
Yeah, agreed. Again, the output will give you something, right?
Yes, yeah,
And it will give you something that feels very certain, and that, of course, is why the inputs need to be from a position, like you said, of understanding, and the subject matter expertise doesn't go away, right?
yes,
So
exactly.
I totally agree there. I'm actually curious, in the classroom, how, particularly in the classroom, for students that are focused on a career in procurement or supply chain, right?
Mm.
Those that you're meeting at Malmo Business School, how are AI topics being discussed, particularly kind of like in the application in business, in the role of procurement and supply chain, and what type of skills are students expected to kind of exit university or an academic setting with?
I would say, unfortunately, at this point in time, the use of AI is limited to, Chat GPT, and, that you need to prompt in a very critical manner, and that you need to,
Mm,
you need to be critical of the outcome of
right.
the Chat GPT. Um, what is interesting is,
Mhm.
and then you also get into the research topic, the teaching, or the professors that are working with research. Um, there is very little, let's say, material available that actually can show students, what does AI just now do for procurement. There's many students that feel, of course,
Yeah.
highly insecure because of, in the future AI will, take over my role as a procurement. So why would I want to stay here, right? And I always tell them, if the procurement is perfectly organized within an organization,
Yeah.
you would not be needed in any case, right? So you would
Right, right.
always get into an organization where there is stuff to do.
Mm.
And I think if it's a high school or if it's a university, I think there needs to be a lot of there needs to be available a lot of training materials that actually looks at different AI applications, just to prepare people in a better way, right, for the future roles. I invited in strategic procurement classes. I invited suppliers of these tools. Could have been Kodiak Hub as well. Your suppliers of these tools, just to explain, this is how the tool works. This is where AI comes into the picture, etc., etc. So it's to connect, let's say, the business world with classes and research is really an important area to create these sort of opportunities where people can explain, this is what is happening. It's an important thing for schools to take with them, actually.
100%. If you were to look back at yourself starting your career in procurement, again, you have over 30 years under your belt. What's like a piece of advice you would give yourself starting out that you now know today that you maybe didn't know then, but you've captured along the way?
I believe that would circle around communication, because having gone through a number of different MBAs, right, having gone through years of study, everything is theoretical,
Right.
and you think you have been prepared for real life work, knowing your theory, and you are ready to apply this in business. In the first 10, 15 years of my career, I did not really probably understand how critically important it is to communicate at the right level with the right people, to keep everybody in the boat and to make sure that there's alignment there. And that is something that I would immediately, do different if I would start again, for sure. Yeah.
Yeah. And I think that what you're talking about there is that stakeholder choreography, as another guest of ours, Bobby Bashinsky, talked about. And I think that it is so critical, particularly in the role of procurement and supply chain, to understand that and to be a strong communicator, which is a soft skill that, I think that the next generation needs to continue to focus on, regardless of the hard skills that they're gaining. But also, beyond being a good communicator, to understand people's driving factors or their driving motivators, right? What do these other stakeholders want? Starting with their end in mind and being able to understand kind of the drivers, that I think is what helps one to be able to choreograph in the procurement role in a very effective manner as well. And I think that it's critical. It's critical.
Yes. Yeah. What I also tell my students always, never go to your boss only with a problem. You should always go to your boss with, different sort of solutions that exist, right? So just talking about the challenges that are there, that is not sufficient. You have to start thinking, okay, if I have this problem, what sort of solutions are possible? And then you can also meet your stakeholders at a different level, because then you can create a discussion, you can create, different scenarios.
Yeah.
And people forget that also very quickly. People believe that the boss is there to solve problems, but that is not, in my world, that is not the task of of a manager, if you wish. So that's an additional thing, managing stakeholders and providing different scenarios and options for problems.
There's this 1-3-1 method that I think that, if anyone that's listening is not familiar with, it's, coming with one clearly defined problem or challenge, also then outlining 3 potential viable solutions so that you, together with your line manager or others involved in impacted by that particular problem, can come with one best course of action, right? The one problem, 3 viable solutions, one best course of action. And I think that it's a framework that stands the test of time. And I agree with you wholeheartedly, right? And that's just something that I think a lot of people learn along the way and learn it the hard way, rather than, for example, knowing it up front. Crystal ball out. My final question for you here, Wilbert. Looking 5 years ahead, okay? Um, what will great manufacturing procurement teams be doing less of, and what will they be doing more of as well?
I always say that everything that can be automated should be automated in the procurement process. Which means that once the demand of an article is clear, then there should be a process that converts this demand into procurement, into a purchase order, um, sending this purchase order to an allocated supplier. This whole process that should be automated as much as it's possible. Procurement teams, they need to monitor more these processes. They need to establish the risks that are in the supply chain that are going to impact these processes. They need to monitor, let's say, the performance of suppliers, of maybe weather events. They need to monitor things around the process, right? So great companies, they have the right set of data that is clean, that can be worked with.
Yeah.
They have a forecasting and a business process in place that are considering all of these variables. There will be AI tools that double check if things are outliers or if it's really a normal trend in doing the business.
Yeah.
And you have then people monitoring these processes. And this monitoring, this is going to take more and more and more time, because legislation picks up, dynamics in the market is just increasing. So there is, I do not see that, let's say, procurement teams need to be reduced in size. I would say the other way around, that, I think there's more and more people needed in order to make sure that these processes are working, perfectly all right. So that would be my crystal ball. That would be my, vision for procurement teams and supply chain teams, if you wish.
And if we reduce it down, what it really is it's less manual, right? And more monitoring, getting put in the seat of the editor rather than the doer, right? And I think that's what we see with a lot of functions, across the business. And I don't think that procurement should be any different. So I love the insights. And Wilbert, thank you so much for being able to join us today and share your knowledge and unique perspective on things with the various roles and hats that you wear. I would love to be able to round off with a quick fire. We do it with all of our guests. It doesn't have to be anything about procurement, and it won't be anything about procurement or your career. It's about you, Wilbert, to get to know you. 3 simple questions, 1 word or 1 sentence answers. Sound like a plan?
Of course, always.
All right. All right. Now, we talked about it before the episode, but Baerwaldt actually means bare woods, correct? In it comes from a German origin, or loosely translated.
Correct. Yeah. Yeah.
Okay. So I'm actually interested. Would you follow your last name and be more interested in taking a hike in the woods or hanging out on the beach?
Hike in the woods, for sure.
All right. Very nice. Very nice. I like asking procurement people this just because you're typically somebody that is cost conscious. Are you a Mac or a PC person?
PC.
All right. Directly
Cost
aligned with
conscious.
directly aligned with the procurement background. Last question. All expenses paid trip by Kodiak Hub. You can go by yourself. You can take friends and family. It's up to you. You're leaving tomorrow. Where are you headed?
Nepal.
All right. Very
Hiking,
exciting.
yeah.
And there's some good hikes to be able to be taken there. Absolutely. Well, thank you for hiking to the top of this mountain in this episode with us today, Wilbert. If people want to get in touch with you, learn more about your services, be part of your network, what's the easiest way to do so?
I'm available on LinkedIn, where you can reach out to me. I think that is the easiest way, of course. I also have a website with my company name, wmbconsult.com with a K and not a C. So please reach out. I love the discussions. I love the, if it could be for a cup of coffee or for anything else, it's, the discussion is always good. Communicate.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Wilbert, for taking the time with us today.
Thank you, Sam. Also, thank you for the opportunity to be here.